Even though tomorrow is a dreadful day for some here present, when the classroom cage opens again and takes them in, today is sort of a graduation day for the Christian community, because we've come to the end of 5 weeks of praying over the 6th chapter of John. Next week we go back to the regular yearly readings from Mark's Gospel. But this is the end of the 6th chapter. 5 weeks it took us to go through it. It's a very long chapter. And as always, we have to remember and think about, who was this written for initially? It was written for a Christian community, a parish, if you will, 50 years after the death and ascension of Jesus. It was written for Jewish Christians, people who up until this time had seen themselves and had been seen by the whole synagogue community as part of Judaism, a sect of Judaism, if you will. Maybe they were considered like you would consider a monastery today, just a bunch of Christians, but who do things differently. They were lighting their candles on Friday night and on Saturday night having their meal together, and then on Sunday they'd go off and celebrate the Eucharist. But now they were beginning to be seen as somebody alien. The rest of the Jewish community was beginning to look upon them with suspicion and to sort of get rid of them. Heretics, they would be called in our terminology. And what's worse, the civil authorities were beginning to look upon these Christians of John's community as somehow political aliens. This was the beginning of the time of the persecutions. So this was a very, very unsafe group of people to belong to. And it was a people who were beginning to look upon themselves and saying, what is this all about? Are we on the right track? So John wrote his gospel to re-convince or re-preach the initial good news to his people. And the 6th chapter is extremely important. So when they say in the gospel today, this is a difficult teaching, they're not just talking about drink my blood and eat my flesh. That's not what they're talking about. This isn't a problem with the Eucharist. This is a problem with the whole message of Jesus that has been delineated in these 5 sections that we've heard over the past Sundays of the 6th chapter of John. This is real critical stuff. Are we going to stay with Christ, or are we going to go elsewhere? What is the bottom line of the message of Jesus? What is the bottom line, the very basic minimum that we are asked to accept? John would tell us, in many words, it is this, that we are unconditionally loved by God. That not only are we unconditionally loved by God, but everything that God has created is loved unconditionally by God. Not just people, but things. Not just human beings, but the whole solar system, the whole universe, the whole cosmos, whatever the biggest word is today. The boundaries seem to be getting pushed farther and farther out. Everything is unconditionally loved by God, despite anything. In our case, despite our sins. And what Jesus is asking us and challenging us to do is to love unselfishly in imitation of his Father, after the example that he, as a human being, personally gave us. The teaching is God's unconditional love. The question is, will you love in the same way, unselfishly? And we, in the church, I think, are are much like the community of John in the end, in those 50 years after Jesus. We are in a period of great unrest because we are beginning to ask ourselves that same question again and trying to answer it. In a way, you might say that 50 years ago, when John the 23rd became Pope, we say he threw open the windows of the church. We're beginning to realize that was just house cleaning. Now we're being asked to throw open the doors of the church. But not only the church, but the doors of each individual Christian's life. We are asked to be closed to no one, but to love unselfishly. Because unselfish love is a meaningless phrase unless there is an object of love. You have to love someone. You can't just love in a vacuum. And so we are being asked to open ourselves to all of God's creation, including the planet, but especially the people on the planet, and to accept them in the same way that the Father accepts us, warts and all. So when Jesus says to the disciples, "Will you also go away?" He's not asking them to give their opinion or their acceptance of Holy Communion or the Eucharist, although that's part of the Jesus experience. He's asking them, will you love unselfishly? And it's upon the answer to that question whether we'll know whether we graduate or not.